The year is 1456. 3 years have passed since Constantinople ceased to exist as a Christian city. The queen of the Eastern world, seat of a civilization stretching across 1,000 years, was swallowed by an Ottoman surge. Her legendary walls, never breached in over a millennium of warfare, finally gave way beneath the thunder of the largest cannons ever cast. Her great cathedral now echoed with Islamic prayer. Her citizens had been carried off into captivity. The last emperor of Rome perished on his own battlements with sword in hand, and with him died the belief that the East could endure. The man behind it all was Sultan Mehmed II, 24 years old, razor-sharp, and consumed by a hunger for immortality. He had sworn to raise the crescent banner over every church, from the Bosphorus to the Rhine. Constantinople had not been an ending. It had been a beginning. Now his gaze moved north toward Belgrade, the fortress city perched where the Sava and Tisa rivers pour into the Danube, the gateway to Central Europe. If Belgrade fell, Hungary lay open. If Hungary collapsed, Vienna had no shield. If Vienna was taken, the road to Rome would be paved in blood. Mehmed marched north with a force that bent the horizon. 100,000 soldiers advanced in columns so vast they took 4 hours to cross open ground. 30,000 janissaries who had never known retreat, 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, 50,000 engineers and support troops, and 300 guns including the great bombard that had shattered Constantinople's walls, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. 200 warships moved up the Danube, their siege towers stretching above the waterline like cathedral spires on the move. Across Europe, kings fell quiet. The Holy Roman Empire remained paralyzed by internal divisions. France was occupied with its own designs. The Italian states squabbled over commerce. Pope Calixtus III proclaimed a crusade and heard nothing but his own echo. No relief army was forming. No banners were gathering. Belgrade would face what was coming entirely on its own. Inside the fortress, fewer than 7,000 soldiers prepared to make their final stand. The walls had been built for an era of sword and scaling ladder, not for the modern age of mass artillery. Their commander was John Hunyadi, 68 years old, the White Knight of Wallachia, a man who had devoted his entire life to pushing back the Ottoman tide and had somehow survived it. He had won engagements that every reasonable calculation said he should have lost. But he had never faced anything remotely like this. Beside him stood Giovanni da Capistrano, 70 years old, a Franciscan friar whose voice could silence a marketplace and whose faith burned with a heat that ordinary men could not match. He had traveled across Europe preaching holy war, gathering peasants, farmers, and laborers along the way, men with no armor, little training, and no obvious reason to be there except conviction. Together, these two aging men, a soldier and a monk, commanded perhaps 30,000 souls against the largest war machine on the continent. The arithmetic was merciless. 10 Ottoman soldiers for every defender, 100 Ottoman cannons for every Hungarian gun. The finest professional warriors on earth against farmers who had barely held a sword before. Every informed voice across Europe had already written Belgrade off. The only open question was the precise hour of its fall. But Hunyadi and Capistrano understood something that no map could capture: that the will to resist, true unyielding resistance, does not automatically shrink in proportion to the size of the force bearing down on it. That ordinary men, given a reason that reaches past logic and into something deeper, will sometimes do what should be impossible. Capistrano walked the ruined streets each evening and spoke in language that needed no translation. He described Constantinople's fate: children taken as slaves, churches defaced, a darkness that had no natural boundary and would only stop when someone, stopped it. His words did what sermons rarely manage. They altered what people were willing to endure. Farmers began to act like soldiers. Knights dug trenches beside laborers they would normally have ignored. Because when the walls are crumbling and the sky is thick with smoke, rank matters far less than presence. And the presence of 30,000 people who had chosen to remain became the most powerful weapon Belgrade possessed. The guns opened on July 4th, and the world changed its sound. 300 Ottoman cannons fired in rotating sequence, creating a sustained roar that never fully paused. The great bombard discharged once per hour, each round tearing chunks from walls that had stood for generations. Inside the city, the air turned to smoke and prayer. Buildings collapsed. Church towers fell. The river gates shattered on the third day. An entire bastion was simply erased. The defenders worked through each night, hauling rubble into the breaches before dawn, positioning whatever guns they had, firing back at a force they couldn't match by any numerical measure. For every Ottoman cannon silenced, 10 more answered. The walls continued to erode. Belgrade continued to hold. Hunyadi appeared to be everywhere at once, his white hair gray with powder smoke, his voice cutting through the din of bombardment. He moved along the ramparts like a figure from a different century, patching breaches with his own hands, standing in the open while Ottoman gunners searched for their range, refusing to behave like someone who was losing. The men watching him understood without being told. Courage, they could see, is not the absence of terror. It is the refusal to let terror make the decisions. Capistrano was equally impossible. A 70-year-old friar who had every reason to be somewhere far from this. He wandered through the most dangerous sections of the city carrying his crucifix while arrows fell nearby, preaching to soldiers who couldn't decide whether he was mad or blessed, and eventually stopped trying. The result was the same either way. When an old man walks toward danger rather than away from it, the young man standing beside him finds it very difficult to justify his own retreat. Week by week, the outer defenses gave way. By July 14th, the outer wall had fallen. The air tasted of iron and rot. Children coughed from the smoke in cellars. The defenders were worn to a hollow version of themselves. Across the river, the Ottoman camp glowed at night like a second city. Mehmed dined on lamb while Belgrade starved. He had dispatched word to Istanbul that the fortress would fall before August. He was 24 years old and had never been mistaken before. He did not truly believe that conviction could outlast gunpowder. He was about to learn otherwise. July 21st, 1456. Before dawn, the Ottoman artillery went silent for the first time in weeks. The sudden absence of sound was somehow more unsettling than the bombardment itself. Into that silence came something else. Drums. Tens of thousands of them, beating in unison. The war rhythm of the Janissaries, the cadence that had preceded the fall of 100 cities across 2 continents. Then the horns. Then the advance. 30,000 Janissaries moved in perfect formation toward the breached walls. Behind them came scaling equipment and siege towers. Behind them, the cavalry waited to run down anyone who fled. Inside Belgrade, 7,000 battered soldiers and 20,000 peasants watched them come. John Hunyadi walked the walls one final time. "Today we do not fight for kings," he told them. "We fight because letting this darkness through is something we cannot live with. Hold the walls. Hold your ground. If we fall like thunder. If we stand forever." The Janissaries reached the breaches at dawn and poured through. The fighting was immediate, close, and brutal. Blade meeting blade, the professional soldiers of the greatest army on earth, pressing against men who had no business surviving another hour. The defenders matched them step for step. A siege tower reached the ramparts and was set ablaze by peasants with torches. The river gate fell and was recaptured. By mid-morning, the Ottomans held a third of the fortress. Mehmed watched from his command post and believed the outcome was already decided. Then Capistrano did something without military logic. He gathered every peasant still standing, 10,000 of them, raised his cross, and led them forward through the breaches. Not to defend a position, to attack. The Janissaries saw the mob coming toward them, screaming in their direction, and they hesitated. That hesitation was the pivot point of the battle. Hunyadi drove 500 cavalry through the gap. The Ottoman line, which had never broken, began to fracture. Units wavered. An arrow struck Mehmed in the thigh. He fell from his horse. His guard rushed to shield him. The army saw it, and the army broke. By nightfall, the Ottoman camp was burning. The powder magazines had exploded in a blast, heard 50 miles away. The fleet had fled south in disarray. 25,000 Ottoman soldiers were dead. The rest were retreating in chaos toward the south. Belgrade stood. Europe stood. Pope Calixtus III, when the news reached him, issued a decree that the church bells of every parish in Christendom should ring at noon each day, every day, without end, so that no future generation would forget the morning when the few refused to fall.